Welcome everybody. I'm Rebecca Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the Law, Ethics, and Animals program, and welcome to our final event of this fall's speaker series. We are so pleased to have Ann Linder here for this event to discuss her research on animal markets in the United States and the risks they pose to humans and animals alike and the policymaking needed to address them. Ann is the Associate Director of Policy and Research, as well as a Wildlife and Live Animal Markets Fellow with the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School. Much of her work focuses on the intersection of animal law and criminal law, including wildlife trafficking. Prior to her role at Harvard, she worked as a wildlife policy analyst for the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University, and she's also spent time working with the Animal Protection Unit for the City of Austin in Texas. Her work has been published by Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, and Lewis and Clark Law School, as well as the New York Bar Association. She received her law degree from Stanford Law School and holds a Master's of Science in Animals and Public Policy from Tufts. She's the lead author of a major new report by the Harvard Law School and New York University entitled Animal Markets and Zoonotic Disease in the United States that documents how the U.S. has no comprehensive strategy to mitigate zoonotic diseases from animal markets, and is incredibly ambitious and just excellent in its content and more. And it's the first of many more such reports to come, which Ann will tell us all about. This report was featured when it came out on the front page of the New York Times. So before I hand it off to Ann, a few announcements. This event is being recorded. If you want to watch it afterwards or watch any of our other events, they will be available on the LEAP YouTube channel. And then finally, thank you to our event co-sponsors, the Yale Animal Ethics Study Group, the Yale Animal Law Society, and the Yale Environmental Law Association, as well as the Yale Sustainable Food Program. And with that, please join me in welcoming Ann.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. It's a treat to be here with all of you, and thanks to our host, the LEAP program, who were also kind enough to lend us the talents of some of their students and fellows who helped with the research that I'm going to talk about today. I also want to thank Professor Kaiser, who bravely served as one of our reviewers on this report and made it through all 170 pages. Thanks to Dale Jameson and our colleagues at NYU, who've been really true partners in this research with us from the beginning. I also want to thank the Brooks Institute, who generously supported our work in this space and so many others. While this project is housed at Harvard, we're just one of a constellation of institutions who've contributed to this project. So I want to thank them and also our global partners as well. We have global partners because infectious disease is, of course, a global problem. And while I'm going to be focusing today primarily on the US and our contribution to that global risk, this is just one part, as Rebecca mentioned, of a much larger project that has spanned 36 months and 15 countries and 6 continents. So before we zoom in on the US, I want to try and frame this problem for you in that larger context. Roughly 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin, meaning they spread from animals to humans. Disease transmission from animals to humans poses deep and dynamic public health threats as well as significant policy challenges. SARS, Ebola, Lyme disease, and HIV are just a few examples. HIV alone has killed more than 40 million people. But many experts predict that future pandemics could have death tolls that are even higher, stretching into the hundreds of millions or possibly even the low billions. And we also have good reason to think that these types of large-scale disease events are only going to become more common, particularly as climate continues to warm. We know and have known for some time that animal health, human health, and environmental health are all deeply connected, but too often animal health acts as sort of the neglected leg of this One Health equation. Generally speaking, most scientists and policymakers know very little about the types and forms of animal industry that can pose zoonotic risk. And if you don't know what's out there, it's very difficult to study it or to regulate it. Over the course of our research, we found ourselves asking questions of policymakers about industries that they didn't know existed, or first learned of when the animals in them started contracting COVID-19. It's tempting to think of zoonotic disease as a static list. Gonna go? That's okay, we can skip this slide. Oh no, it stopped working altogether. Okay. That's good, we'll just go on to the next slide. It's tempting to think of zoonotic disease as a static list, one that can be numbered and triaged understood, but to do so obscures the living and ever-evolving nature of this risk, while at the same time perhaps overstating our own ability to catalog and capture nature's growing Rolodex of disease. Pathogens that we once considered non-zoonotic have now spread from animals to humans, evolving over time to inhabit new hosts. COVID-19 has kind of given the world a crash course in disease ecology and demonstrated the ways in which pathogens, in particular viruses, can change over time into different and sometimes more dangerous forms. But there's still much that we don't know about disease, and millions of pathogens that science has yet to catalog, and species of wildlife who themselves have yet to be discovered that are carrying these pathogens. While zoonotic disease is not a new problem, we're coming to it at a particular point in time, and there's characteristics of this modern era that can amplify that risk. So I'd like to first sort of anchor us here in the Anthropocene, where the world is highly globalized, and where we swim in uncharted waters as far as human and domestic animal population levels. Human population has radically expanded, and we're producing more animals than ever to feed ourselves, processing more than 85 billion land animals for consumption last year. Humans and our domestic animals now account for 96% of mammalian biomass, leaving wild animals with just 4%. And we're also producing large amounts of specific species of animals with very limited genetic diversity and numbers far outside what we would expect to see in nature, and potentially creating kind of dangerous monocultures in that way. The amount of chickens produced each year outnumbers all wild birds. If you tried to count those chickens, it would take you 8,000 years. But these animals are so common that there will literally be a strata of chicken bones that marks the present era in the archaeological record. Zoonotic diseases are deeply tied to human behavior and human use of animals. Animal commerce in its various forms has proven to be a dominant driver of zoonotic disease risk, linked with the emergence of SARS, MERS, Nipah, possibly COVID-19, and others. Animals today fulfill every use imaginable. Some serve as food, others as fur, fiber, for pets, medicine, decoration, dyes, entertainment, research, cosmetics, and hundreds of other uses, too numerous to name. The largest of these industries is livestock production. At any moment in the US, we're outnumbered by our livestock 3-1. But risk can come from anywhere. Massed palm civets, thought to be the source of the SARS epidemic, are farmed to make specialty coffee that's made from their droppings. These human-animal interactions are set against a backdrop of environmental change, marked by warming climates, population expansion, large-scale changes in land use, and growing demand for animal protein. Each of these forces increases the pressure on wild spaces and the animals that call them home. As we tighten our grip on the natural world and its other inhabitants, we're also exposing ourselves to the pathogens that they carry. Infilling these once wild areas with domestic animals creates this sort of 1-2 punch, exposing livestock to high-risk species of wildlife who also interact closely with humans. This chain of disease transmission from wildlife to livestock to humans has been well established by Nipah virus, Hendra virus, and others. At the same time, we import exotic animals from all over the world, and in doing so, we sort of shuffle this Rubik's Cube of nature, introducing invasive species to native ones. This unnatural mixing brings with it new opportunities for diseases that might never have existed without our assistance. Zoonotic disease, as we know, is a global problem. A threat anywhere is a threat everywhere when we're talking about pathogens that are 10,000 times smaller than the head of a pen and can travel at the same speed we do. But even though these are global threats, we don't always think of them as a global problem. And too often we see ourselves and our own behavior as somehow outside of this equation. But to think that we play no part in this global risk here in the US when we use and consume more animals here than in almost any other nation on Earth, I think would be the height of hubris. Many Americans consider live animal markets, elsewhere called wet markets, to be dangerous, but we have these markets here in the US as well, 84 of them in New York City alone. Many might also look down on the consumption of bushmeat, but Americans consumed over 1 billion pounds of bushmeat last year. We just refer to it instead as game. The US, in fact, I think has plenty of risk. By some counts, more emerging diseases originated in the United States than any other country in the world during the second half of the 20th century. And many believe that the most dangerous or most deadly outbreak of that century, the 1918 influenza pandemic, could have possibly originated in a stockyard in Kansas. That outbreak killed 7 times as many in absolute terms as COVID-19 has to date, at a time when the world's population was just a quarter of its current size. That virus took more lives of Americans than the World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. But in 2023, we will spend more than 1,600 times on military defense than pandemic preparedness. The US is a significant contributor to zoonotic risk, but before we get into the specifics of where that risk is and what it looks like, I want to try and first sort of foreground this a bit by going through a little bit of science, on disease transmission. There's different types of pathogens, but our research focuses primarily on viruses, which are widely considered the most likely to give rise to a large-scale global pandemic. Viruses exist in nature at all times, and every virus needs a living organism or host to sustain it. So each virus then has one or more what we'll call natural reservoirs, which are host species that allow the virus to survive indefinitely in nature, often without causing symptoms of disease or problems for that host species. So you can think of that as a kind of truce between a virus and its carrier. Bats, for example, might carry a lot of viruses that aren't harmful to them, but would cause problems for us as humans. So there's two ways then, basically, that a virus can make its way to humans. Either we can be infected directly by the host species, right there at the top, or, and perhaps more commonly, that virus might pass to humans through an intermediate host. Not every virus found in a host species can be transmitted directly to humans. This is kind of a lock and key concept. You can think of it that way. So oftentimes intermediate or bridge hosts take the virus from the reservoir species to infect humans. So let's look at an example. Hendra virus spilled over through the horse racing industry in Australia and caused the death of stable hands and racing jockeys and veterinarians there. Bats were identified as the natural reservoir of Hendra, but even Hendra-positive bats who bit wildlife rehabilitators couldn't infect them with the disease. Instead, what was happening was horses were grazing underneath these trees where the bats were roosting. They were becoming infected with Hendra and then were able to transmit the virus ultimately to humans. So the important point here to remember is just that it's not simply the human-animal interactions that are driving zoonotic risk, but the interactions among and between different animals themselves. And that's one reason why some of these industries that we're looking at are so dangerous. If you have a wide variety of species all held together, you can imagine how you're sort of giving a virus a buffet of different intermediate hosts and pathways through which it can reach humans. And generally, more pathways equals more risk. And those host species could be wild ones or domestic ones like livestock as well. We also know that risk can grow along supply chains as animals move and are aggregated in greater numbers. This research came out of Vietnam and looked at rates of coronaviruses in field rats, which are a common food there. They consume about 3,500 tons of field rats each year. And they tested them at different points in the supply chain. And what they found was that the percentage of rats infected with these viruses grew as they moved from 20% of rats held by wild-caught trappers to more than 30% by the time they reached large markets. And finally, 55% of rats in restaurants were testing positive at the time they ended up on people's plates. So this is troubling for lots of reasons, but it illustrates why it's so important to understand the supply chains that are feeding these industries. Once a disease spills over into humans, there's a few different questions that will determine its trajectory. Many of these diseases are not harmful, and many can also not spread one person to another. And at that point, sort of how contagious the virus is and other factors will determine its spread within a human population. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that animals also suffer pandemics, and many of these are made possible or made worse by humans. Populations of starfish in the U.S. dropped 99% off the U.S. coast in just 24 months after the introduction of adensovirus, which left their disarticulated arms washing back and forth across the seafloor. Little brown bats, once one of the most numerous species of bats in North America, saw similar declines after the introduction of white nose syndrome. There's a single pathogen that's responsible for the extinction of 90 species of frogs, driving 124 other ones to the precipice of extinction. 60 of them were gone before we even realized what was killing them. As one commenter observed, no other disease has burned down more of the tree of life. Humans can also infect animals through a process called reverse zoonoses. We saw this up close during the COVID-19 pandemic when people were infecting their pets with the virus. This direction of disease transmission is critically important and understudied. But when disease spill over from one species to another, they don't necessarily stop, but can keep spilling from humans to animals and back again, creating sort of dangerous cycles that can allow for the emergence of new pathogens. We also saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where you had mink farmers who infected their animals with the virus then changed in the mink and was retransmitted back to humans. Globally, the United States is an epicenter of demand for animals and animal products. High levels of wealth and demand per capita, combined with the sheer population size of the US, make us a premier consumer market for animals. US demand also drives extractive practices in search of animals in much of the developing world, which causes risk upstream and elsewhere in the supply chain. The US is the world's largest importer of domestic animals and among the top producers as well. Americans eat more meat per capita than any other country, twice as much as most, about 214 pounds per person per year. The US is also the largest importer of wildlife in the world, bringing in hundreds of millions of live wild animals annually, many of those without any health or safety checks, some without ever being seen by anyone. These animals go on to live in our backyards, in our basements, kept as exotic pets, or in research laboratories, roadside petting zoos, or elsewhere. And alongside this set of large industries exists a vast array of smaller ones, and each of those carry its own constellation of risks. Many of these we never see and we never think about. Some of them we never even know about, from camel farms to captive hunting operations, back guano harvesting to backyard birds, swap meets, exotic animal auctions, livestock fairs, petting zoos, coyote urine producers, and wholesale wildlife dealers who keep thousands of animals together in vast warehouses. Here in the US, we looked at 36 different animal markets or industries, which we defined sort of broadly to encompass a range of commercial venues where humans and animals interact. Part of what we were trying to do was to map the supply chains that run through each of these industries, starting with the source all the way to the end purpose that these animals serve. What we found is that these are not self-contained supply chains. Animals are frequently bouncing between different industries. They're changing use throughout their lifetimes, and that change in use is oftentimes accompanied by a change in their legal status. For each of these 36 industries, we tried to evaluate the risk of zoonotic disease that industry posed by looking at a variety of different risk factors. We also tried to look at risk mitigation. So in other words, what steps are being taken to reduce that risk of disease. Often this comes in the form of regulation. Don't worry about the small font, no one has to read this. Zooming in now on one of those industries, we'll take a closer look at a few different examples and some of those risk factors in context. So starting with animal agriculture. The first thing that you'll notice about this industry is that it's very large, and the sheer scale of livestock production demands that we take disease risk from livestock seriously. The smallest dot here, the little red one, represents 3 million animals, so you can think of that as the state of Connecticut. These are cows being raised for veal. I didn't show you this just to make you dizzy, but it might have that effect. Agricultural Research Service warned, quote, "The U.S. currently has the largest, most genetically homogeneous, and thus potentially most disease-susceptible population of food animals in the history of mankind, warning that an outbreak could, quote, lead to immediate and disastrous results." That quote was from more than a decade ago, and since then the problem has only grown by about 200 million animals per year. The vast majority of those animals are chickens, followed by pigs. These two species are particularly notable because they're both potential carriers of influenza viruses, which we're concerned about because of their so-called pandemic potential. Each one of these icons represents 40 million animals, so you can think of those as California or Canada or Poland. 41% of the land in the lower 48 is dedicated to livestock production in some way. Today, the majority of crops grown in the U.S. are not fed to humans, but to our animals. Here we rely almost exclusively on intensive systems of livestock production that are highly concentrated and highly efficient. 98 or 99% of the meat we eat in the U.S. comes from facilities like this one rather than smallholder family farms. Here, the name of the game is to produce as many animals as possible in as small space as possible, as quickly as possible. Some of these facilities are enormous. They can contain up to 6 million animals at a single site. And while this system is incredibly efficient, creating high and huge concentrations of animals also carries implications for disease risk. For example, with Nipah virus in Malaysia, some experts believe that that virus was circulating in the region for quite some time, but it wasn't until the consolidation of the pig farming industry from more dispersed smallholders into larger operations that that virus was able to make its way to humans. When outbreaks occur at these facilities, they can occur at scale, and the cleanup process, as you can imagine, is quite difficult as well. So these animals are not socially distanced, and in fact, the conditions that exist at these facilities tend to be precisely those that facilitate disease transmission, where you have many animals that are crowded together with poor ventilation, poor hygiene, often poor welfare. And on top of that, these populations tend to lack genetic diversity, which can act as a buffer to disease. These conditions lead to high levels of stress, which undermines their immune health and makes them more susceptible. Stress can also cause injuries and drive behaviors including self-mutilation and cannibalism, both of which might also heighten the risk of disease exposure. Sorry to say this while you're all eating your lunch. And you also have workers sort of walking around and through these animal populations, picking out and collecting dead ones, removing them. Given these densities, it's probably unrealistic to think that a worker might notice a single sick animal moving among a herd of thousands. So this has something to do with response time as well. Industrial farms do, though, have some of the strongest biosecurity measures of any industry. Some of these are shower in, shower out facilities where you have to put on little booties and a Tyvek suit before going inside. Even so, there's no such thing as perfect biosecurity. Pathogens like the current H5N1 influenza outbreak infected hundreds of these facilities and left 58 million birds dead on industrial farms in the last year. One last point here, to prevent animals from getting sick under these conditions, they're sometimes fed a steady stream of antibiotics. About 65 or 70% of medically significant antibiotics in the US are fed to livestock, 13 million pounds. Antibiotic overuse is problematic for public health because it can drive the creation of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, for example. The FDA has taken some first steps at addressing this problem, but they've made it fairly easy for producers to get around those regulations. In many cases, antibiotics are being used prophylactically rather than to treat existing illness. They can be prescribed not to an individual, but to a herd of animals, and sometimes there's no end date on those prescriptions. So these are all things that you couldn't do in human medicine, for example. So in this way, animal agriculture is both sort of increasing our risk of zoonotic disease, but at the same time making us less able to treat some of those same infections. I think it's important to note that the people who are most vulnerable to zoonotic disease are often the workers in these facilities, who are sharing air and interacting with live and dead animals. Studies estimate that workers at swine facilities have 30 times a greater risk of zoonotic influenza than the general public. But studies also show that their spouses, their children, even the communities that they live in are also at increased risk. And we know that while these people are the most at risk, they might also be among the least likely and least able to report disease or to seek medical care. These are low-income jobs. They tend to disproportionately be staffed by people of color or people in rural communities. Often those folks can't afford to miss work, so they might come in even if they're not feeling well and potentially infect their coworkers, or otherwise just generally delay seeking medical care because they don't have insurance or because of their immigration status. But disease can spread person to person far beyond this handful of livestock workers. So in this way, an unequal system could also be an unsafe one. Those of you familiar with the space will know that there's very little regulation of animals farmed for food. The USDA is the premier federal authority in the space, but they've consistently maintained that they don't have authority to regulate on-farm activities, that their authority begins, quote, at the slaughterhouse door. We know, though, that these pathogens can spill over at any point during the chain of production and spread from there. In extreme cases, regulators might lack basic information about how many livestock operations exist and where. In 2017, when they were surveying aerial photographs, Iowa's Department of Natural Resources found 4,200 previously unknown animal production facilities in that state alone. There's a lot of focus in the US on food safety and on these later stages of processing. But whether a virus spreads from a consumer who eats a hamburger or a worker at an industrial farm, it can move from either of those two people through the population at large. A significant amount of animals die in transport to slaughter. According to an analysis of USDA data, we think about 20 million chickens, a third of a million pigs, and 166,000 cows die in transport each year. Many more are arriving sort of unable to walk or stand. We don't know the cause of death of those animals, so there's no way to know how many of them are dying from disease or something else like starvation or dehydration or heat. After they arrive at slaughterhouses, they are required to undergo visual inspection by the USDA. And during this process, they'll remove any animals that show sort of visible signs of disease. And this is good and sounds good in theory, but if you're removing one animal for signs of infectious disease from the herd and weaving the others through, that doesn't actually make a lot of sense because these animals have been raised together, they were just packed together on a transport truck, so if one of them is infected, the other ones have likely been exposed. We're also likely missing a lot, so if you imagine sort of how many infectious diseases a doctor could diagnose in a patient from across the room without talking to them, just by looking at them, there's some diseases that would certainly be visible in stage tuberculosis, for example, but many that would be missed, including any asymptomatic ones. And this is probably even more true when we take into account how quickly these inspections are happening. We said there's 10 billion animals being commercially produced, but we have less than 8,000 food safety inspectors. So that means that each inspector has to inspect 1.2 million animals a year, a little under 25,000 a week, 600 animals an hour. And that's assuming that they work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and never go to the bathroom. So let's take a closer look at a different industry now. So this is fur farming. Fur farming is a form of wildlife farming, which is the breeding and production of wild animals in captivity. We're particularly interested in wildlife farming because it combines high-risk species of wildlife with high-risk practices similar to what we just looked at with industrial farms. Globally, wildlife farming is a surprisingly large industry. It's worth about $74 billion in China alone, and accounts for the employment there of 14 million people. So if you took all those people to the US and we made them a state, they would have about 25 electoral votes and rank just below New York in population size. So this is a significant industry, and the majority of those people in China, at least, are not producing animals for food or for traditional medicine, but fur is actually the largest segment of that industry by far. Zooming back in here on the US just a little bit, we raise about 3 million mink here in the US each year, followed by foxes. They're the next most numerous species. Mink are considered high risk for zoonotic disease, and they're actually used as human models in research because their respiratory system is similar in certain ways to ours. Conditions on these fur farms tend to be extremely poor. You have lots of animals crowded together in small wire cages. Sometimes you have cages stacked on top of each other, so waste from the animals above might fall onto those below or onto the floor. There's also high-risk human-animal interactions going on here. So it's not just that we're producing these animals, but oftentimes they're being manually slaughtered and skinned on site. So plenty of opportunities for disease transmission. Fur farms tend to have very low levels of biosecurity. There are frequent escapes. So there have been cases where farmed mink have escaped and spread viruses they were carrying to wild mink populations and introduced disease into native wildlife that way. You might also have birds and rodents or cats and dogs sort of wandering in and out of these mink sheds at various times. Recently, there was a large outbreak of H5N1 influenza on a Spanish fur farm, and they think that started when a mink grabbed an infected bird and pulled it into its cage. But from that mink, the virus then appeared to be spreading mammal to mammal within the fur farm. So you can imagine how this is concerning to us as humans. In a New York Times piece on zoonoses from mink, the reporter described interviewing operators who were wearing flip-flops and standing between knee-high ridges of mink waste. So this is not the same kind of closed system that we were talking about before. Mink bodies are sometimes left out to compost for fertilizer or for other purposes. As far as regulation goes, there's no federal regulation of fur farms, and they're sometimes left almost wholly unregulated at the state level as well. Captive wildlife in general tend to fall into a kind of regulatory void. They're not traditional livestock, so the USDA has very little to do with them, but they're also not free-roaming wildlife, and so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sort of falls outside of their purview as well. Some states don't even require so much as a license to start fur farming, to the point that in 2020, when mink on these fur farms started getting infected with COVID-19, regulators sometimes did not know if, where, or how many fur farms existed in their state. In some cases, they had to approach private industry trade groups and try and ask for that information. In Utah, public health officials were denied access to infected farms and not able to carry out containment efforts there or even basic testing. While other countries have culled their mink populations to contain those outbreaks and the spread of COVID-19, the US chose not to, nor have we followed suit as other nations have moved to sort of phase out these practices altogether because of the significant public health risks that they pose. But I'll say that these threats are becoming sort of even more acute as this H5N1 influenza continues to spread. So shifting gears here a little bit to some analysis. In addition to documenting how these various forms of animal industry generate zoonotic risk, we also wanted to sort of analyze the ways in which the regulatory system manages, or in many cases fails to manage, that risk. Over the course of our research, we observed different problems and patterns that sort of characterize the US policy response to animal markets, and some of those are listed here behind me. Taken together, they reveal the lack of a coordinated, comprehensive approach to addressing zoonotic disease. These challenges culminate in a system whereby regulation is not always proportional to risk, and the resultant landscape is one of confusion and legal gray areas, sometimes marked by under-regulation and, in certain cases, outright regulatory voids. We'll walk through a few examples of these themes so you can see what I mean. So part of what makes regulating animals so difficult is that many animal supply chains are interconnected, as we said. And this overlap and interplay between different forms of animal industry can also increase zoonotic risk, as each one of these practices tends to make the other ones more dangerous. So for example, the geographic proximity between poultry and swine production may increase the risk of generating a new form of influenza virus that can infect humans. Pigs are sort of known as mixing vessels. They're susceptible to both human and avian influenza strains, as well as strains from other pigs. And so they can kind of recombine elements of these strains, generate new ones, and allow avian influenzas, for example, to more efficiently adapt and infect mammals. So housing 8,000 pigs just a few hundred feet away from an operation, keeping 100,000 chickens might allow for significant cross-contamination between these two different groups of animals. Over the last 60 years, production of both pigs and poultry has become increasingly clustered, concentrating in regions of the Midwest and the Southeast, and overlapping in particular in areas like Iowa and North Carolina. One study done in Minnesota, for example, found that turkey farms within 2 kilometers of pig facilities had 8 times higher odds of influenza infection than farms that were located just 4 to 6 miles away. The USDA is aware of these risks. Some of their producer fact sheets explicitly say, quote, "Do not raise pigs and domestic fowl on the same premises." But we know that many producers do just that. And even though the USDA and CDC are familiar with this danger, neither imposes any sort of regulation to address those risks. Pathogens can also spread when animals produced in one industry are then fed to animals in another. So in an outbreak of influenza among mink on a Midwestern fur farm, they traced that back to the food that those animals were fed, which was sort of raw or undercooked turkey meat from birds who were carrying the virus. But when they got those results back from the lab, they found that this particular strain actually originated in swine. So it likely moved from pigs at a pig facility to the turkeys that were then slaughtered, processed, and fed to the mink. So in this way, the connections and the movement between these different industries can increase the risk of disease spread. While many animal markets exist entirely within the private sector, There are several markets for which the government acts not simply as a regulator, but as an active participant, creating and benefiting from the market itself. In these cases, state-sponsored activities might be contributing to disease risk. So, for example, in the public market of hunting and trapping, state departments of Fish and Game are sometimes reliant on the sale of hunting licenses and, by proxy, the sale of wildlife to fund their own agencies in certain circumstances. These incentives can allow disease risks to be overlooked in favor of revenue. For example, in the case of state-run winter feeding grounds for elk. So here, in an attempt to keep population numbers high for hunters, Wyoming has created artificial environments of up to 800 animals or more per acre, in which disease like brucellosis has been found at 13 times the normal levels because these animals are being congregated and overcrowding, sharing food and things like that. In instances like these, the government sort of abandons its role as an impartial regulator and moves from a referee on the sidelines to an active kind of player in the game. State-sponsored bounty programs are another method used by state agencies to increase revenue from hunting license or to protect livestock production. But each of these interactions carries an inherent zoonotic risk. So, for example, to collect certain bounties, you not only have to sort of kill and interact with the dead or dying wild animal, but in some cases you have to manually remove that animal's foot or scalp with a knife. So that's going to expose you to blood and saliva and potentially, cerebrospinal fluid from the animal's brain. In addition, the government sponsors the direct killing of over 1 million wild animals per year through the USDA's Wildlife Services Program, which is used primarily to protect livestock. But each of these interactions carries zoonotic risk, and they can raise secondary issues. For example, how do you safely dispose of hundreds of thousands of dead wild animals? At the same time, state governments also purchase wildlife from private producers and in some cases actually farm wild animals themselves. So government-owned and operated wildlife farms produce hundreds of thousands of game birds at captive breeding facilities to be released on public lands for hunting each fall. Some of these species are neither native to the US nor adapted, and in fact might actually be damaging to the local ecosystems that these agencies are tasked with protecting, but there's very strong consumer demand. As one state agency put it simply, we raise pheasants because people like to hunt them. However, this production process increases the risk of zoonotic disease, including avian influenza. There were documented H5N1 outbreaks at 16 different game bird production farms in the last year alone. Too often, agencies act only when circumstances force their hand. The introduction of Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, to the United States provides an illustration of why more prospective policy is needed. Mpox first arrived in the US in 2003 in a shipment of live rodents and wildlife from Ghana. At the importer's facility in Dallas, they stored those animals next to a container of prairie dogs, and the virus jumped species to infect the prairie dogs there. They then shipped those prairie dogs out across the country and sold them to families at pet stores or through flea markets, swap meet sales. Those prairie dogs then infected people with the virus across 6 different states. In a retrospective report by the Government Accountability Office, they found that the CDC had no prospective risk assessment in place, but if they had, the outbreak might have been avoided. The GAO report, which was commissioned by Congress, concluded that, quote, the CDC generally reacts only when a zoonotic disease problem arises, and that, quote, CDC's regulations are limited to specific species and regions and do not comprehensively prevent the importation of animals that are known to present a high risk of zoonotic disease. 20 years later, very little has changed. The CDC still restricts the import of only a small subset of species, and the rest are largely left to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is an agency that doesn't have the same kind of public health mandate. Many of those animals, we said, enter the U.S. without ever being visually seen by anyone, just approved on paperwork alone. If I want to bring a cat or a dog into the US, there's a process for that. There might be quarantines, vaccines. It's not particularly easy, but if I want to bring in 100 wild mammals, I can avoid a lot of that regulatory red tape. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maintains that they have no ability to detain shipments based on the health of the animals. So whether an animal is healthy is not their concern. A dead or dying wild animal, even one with visible signs of disease, may still be cleared by Fish and Wildlife for import, so long as that animal is not among a handful of protected or endangered species. They're there to look for the conservation status and not the health status of the animals, so they think they have no legal authority to prevent shipments, but they're sort of the dominant agency that's reviewing this wildlife coming in. There's several ways in which we might take a more preventative approach, but it's essential, I think, to move beyond what has happened to look more closely at what could happen. So just to summarize then, animals are used and consumed in the United States on an immense scale, making this country particularly vulnerable to zoonotic disease. The more human-animal interactions, the more opportunities for spillover of disease. And many of those interactions right now are very poorly regulated. At present, the U.S. lacks even basic information about some forms of animal industries that pose zoonotic risks. And there's an urgent need, I think, for more and better data and different types of monitoring across forms of animal industry. While risk cannot be eliminated, it can be reduced. And a lot of that work can be done in ways that would be scarcely felt by the public at large. Law and policy are important tools for reducing that risk. The first step, I think, is to document and better understand the problem. That's what we've tried to do here. But this should be followed by clear-eyed, candid conversations about whether each one of these practices is worth the public health risks that it carries, combined with sort of an effort to reduce and mitigate risk whenever possible. So the goal is not to get rid of all risk, but I think it should be to eliminate unnecessary risk, to address unjustified risk, and really just to be thoughtful about what kinds of risks we're willing to take and what the risks are. So I think that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for being here.